This week, Phil Venables from Google Cloud is with us to discuss advising the president on cyber physical resilience. Then in the security news, when TVs scan your network, bad things can happen. Putty is vulnerable. Crush FTP. Vulnerabilities that will never be fixed. CVEs are for vulnerabilities, silly. You can test for easily guessable passwords too. The Flipper Zero can steal all your passwords. More XZ style attacks. More reasons why you shouldn't use a smart lock, and your keystrokes are showing. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. When it comes to ensuring your company has top-notch security practices, things can get complicated and time-consuming fast. Now you can assess risk, secure the trust of your customers, and automate compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more with a single platform, Vanta. Vanta's leading trust management platform helps you automate evidence collection, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Save hours of work by completing security questionnaires with Vanta AI. Go to securityweekly.com/Vanta to watch their on-demand demo. That's securityweekly.com/VANTA. BreachLock is a global leader in continuous attack surface discovery and penetration testing. Since BreachLock was founded, they are adding over 50 new customers every month. They have discovered over 1 million reported vulnerabilities and performed more than 20,000 pen testing engagements, including pen tests for over 15,000 web applications, 8,000 mobile apps, more than 100,000 APIs, over 10,000 cloud security audits, and over 200,000 network endpoints. They test your entire attack surface and help you mitigate your next cyber breach before it occurs. Know your risk. Contact BreachLock today. Visit securityweekly.com/BreachLock. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 826, being recorded on Wednesday, April 24th, 2024. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. Larry didn't get to introduce me on that one.
Burgundy reads what's on the teleprompter.
Burgundy reads what's on the teleprompter. I can adjust that in the template for next time.
No, it's all good for next time. So, yeah.
Larry's with me here in Purgatory Studios, I guess we're calling it right now. I think it's an appropriate name right now.
It's appropriate. Yeah. Everything is in flux and
influx.
Hence why we were troubleshooting an echo before the show, and I actually have a comfy chair now.
You do.
Maybe we'll see how it lasts through the show, right?
Looks good. Ms. Mandy Logan is here with us. Mandy, welcome.
Good evening, and I'm grateful to say I'm not in purgatory.
Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us.
Always try to be here every week. It's a beautiful place.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Good to have you. Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through the 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register for the conference using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54USECWeekly, USECWEEKLY. We hope to see you there. I won't be there, but I think Josh and Larry both will be there. Or Josh, you won't be there. Will you be there?
And Mandy.
I'll be there.
And Mandy?
Mandy will.
And a bunch of other folks from our other shows.
And like lots of other people that work in cybersecurity. So on the evening of Monday, May 6th, 2024, W2 Communications and the Cyber Risk Alliance are bringing cyber tacos back to San Francisco. If eating free tacos, sipping on margaritas, I said that with my Rhode Island accent, and mingling with cyber professionals from all over the world sounds good to you, make sure you secure your spot by visiting securityweekly.com/cyber tacos.
You had me at tacos.
That's right. We're excited to have Phil Venables, who is the VP CISO of Google Cloud, with us. Phil leads the risk, security, compliance, and privacy teams. And before joining Google, he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, where he held multiple roles over a long career, initially as their first chief information security officer, a role he held for 17 years. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. So it's always nice to when you hear numbers like been a CISO for 17 years in one role, that's like keeping the averages up. That's doing my part
That's right.
to boost the
That's
averages.
good.
Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome.
Nice.
So, Phil, how did you get your start in information security?
Well, so I started off as a software engineer. It was like, I guess, like probably a lot of people that do what we do. It wasn't my life's ambition to be a security person. I started off as a software engineer in various different industries, defense, energy, stumbled into doing software engineering in finance. And then as part of that, it was the dawn of the internet when you had to build most of your security before you could buy it. And being a software engineer, that had some academic background in security, I was the natural person to start writing crypto software, building firewalls, building IDS systems before you could really buy them. And then after that, I was on the long journey to be a CISO. And the plan, at least for the first 10 years, was always to escape back to software engineering. But I'm here today, clearly never escaped, and I still think it's the best job ever.
As soon as you get out, they pull you back in, right?
That's right.
That's how it happens. So how did you come to work for Google Cloud?
Well, so I was, as you said, I was at Goldman Sachs for a while. I'd moved on from the CISO role into a chief risk officer type of role, and did some other things. And I was, just having a fairly kind of quiet time doing that kind of stuff. And then I got the call from Google asking if I wanted to help drive what we do on infrastructure and drive all the things we're doing on cloud, not just security, but all of the privacy, the compliance, and as well as building a team that we use to face off to our customers. So I also run our field CISO team, which is a great team. They're all ex CISOs typically, so we have a lot of engagement with customers, having shared the pain that they have in all of their digital transformations. So it was an offer too good to turn down, and I've been here 3 years, enjoyed every minute of it.
Nice.
That's awesome. And then so one day the president calls you up and says, "Tell me about this cyber security thing." No, that's not how it happened, is it?
Well, it's interesting. So as you said, I'm on this thing so there's a thing called the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology, and it's actually one of I think it's the only government advisory board that reports directly to the president without passing through kind of layers of other things. And it just goes to prove you're never too old in life or accomplished to get imposter syndrome. So I think I'm the only person on this President's Advisory Council that isn't a tenured professor or doesn't have a Nobel Prize. I'm just the lowly engineer that's as part of this. So I've worked on kind of multiple studies as part of PCAST, but the specific one that I co-chaired with Eric Horvitz, who's the chief scientific officer at Microsoft, we co-chaired this cyber physical systems resilience report, which is really pressing home to the administration and the president that we've got to shift from just thinking about cyber. We've clearly got to think about cyber and physical together for all of the reasons that you and especially this audience knows too well. But also we've got to shift into thinking about resilience and making sure that we're not just trying to defend things. We've got to assume attacks get through, natural events happen, disasters happen. And we've got to build systems, particularly critical infrastructure systems, that are capable of withstanding and operating in the face of attacks and disasters. And that, again, is a message that's probably familiar to all of us. We all try and do that every day. But to the wider government community and the wider sectors that support all the critical infrastructure, thinking about cyber physical together and thinking about resilience and how to fight through attacks is something that's still quite novel, unfortunately, which is why we wrote the report.
And so was there a particular event that led to the board members or team getting together to create this report? Did they cite specific examples, Phil?
Well, yeah, I mean, sadly, as we all know, there's just too many examples. And that's part of the reason for doing it. I mean, so we saw things like Colonial Pipeline. We've seen other types of events. But for me, one of the emblematic things that really came up was at the beginning of last year. Some of you may remember this. There was an FAA, a Federal Aviation Administration, systems outage. It wasn't a cyber event, although clearly it could have been. But basically,
Yes.
they had one system that coordinates kind of permission to take off for commercial aviation in the US. And this one system went down. And so I think for most of the morning back at the beginning of 23, basically there was an inadvertent ground stop of US commercial aviation because this one FAA system went down. And so, of course, what happened after that is everybody said, well, what are we going to do to make sure this system never fails again? And we all said, well, a few of us said, well, that's just the wrong way to look at this. The right way to look at it is to say, why is everything dependent on the one system that no matter what we do is inevitably going to fail again in the future? And this made us realize there's this common pattern that we see in cyber and resilience, both for IT and operational technology, where there's a failure of a critical component. It causes some big impact. Everybody throws their hands up and says, wow, we've got to make sure this never happens again. So we have a review, a commission, a review board, or something that dictates a bunch of extra controls. Everybody implements those extra controls. And then everybody gets more comfortable and builds up even more dependency on that one thing that still inevitably fails a few years later. And it has an even bigger impact. And then our response is to turn the screw even harder and try and make things perfect, which they're never going to be. So the tone of the report is, let's assume everything is going to fail, and let's build resilience in our critical infrastructure to tolerate failure at much deeper levels. And in that case, we're still going to have to clearly worry about defense. We're going to have to worry about protecting things as much as we can, because there's many things that shouldn't fail, but plan for the inevitable failure and make sure things can keep running anyway.
Phil, it's interesting as you described that. I was thinking of the relationship between controls and resilience, right? It's very interesting because you're right, we respond. We say, well, we need these controls, which are just like checks. That's not really resilience. So what was your like thoughts and recommendations for being truly more resilient?
Yeah, well, so there was 4 sets of recommendations, but like the big recommendation was, and it's kind of obvious in hindsight, but sort of needed to be said, is the government and the private sector, and in particular the so-called sector risk management agencies, for which there's one that covers each of the critical infrastructure sectors like finance, energy, healthcare, defense, and so on, that we need to set more ambitious performance goals. And what we structured in the report was this notion of setting minimum viable delivery objectives and being explicit about that, and then making sure each company or each organization that delivers those services under all hazards can figure out ways of delivering that service no matter what happens, and then looking at all the different risks that would stopping them doing that. Now, so we'll give an example, and we frame this in the report, is maybe some of these minimum viable delivery objectives should be language like no more than 50,000 people should be ever without some service, say water or electricity or some other public service. No more than 50,000 people should be without service X for more than, say, 5 days. Now, that's kind of easy to state, and I think a lot of organizations would go, sure, we're capable of delivering that. But then when you just sit down and say, how can we make sure we actually deliver that in the face of attacks, in the face of natural disasters, in the face, it starts to creep out that, well, maybe we can't do that in the face of this event, and maybe we can't do that in the space of this other event. And it really starts to stretch people's thinking about resilience, that they then have to think about alternate ways of delivering that service, not just figuring out how to have a backup system. The other thing that happens with this as well is it makes people realize that they need to understand how to operate in degraded states. And we actually need to get comfortable as a society when that happens. So I'll give you an example in, let's say, financial services. So you want financial services, no matter what, to be able to let people make credit card payments and make payroll and let people catch social security checks. You absolutely need that to happen. But maybe you can wait a month before people can issue new mortgages or do a merger and acquisition or do a stock IPO. There are some things that can just be pushed out, but there are some things need to operate even in like a degraded state. And it's one of the kind of the key things we're pushing government organizations and others to think harder about.
Josh?
Phil, it's fascinating. You're talking about some very classic risk management strategies, determine what your objectives are, determine what you're willing to live with for what amount of time in terms of contingencies or issues. And then your point about degraded state reminds me of NASA. NASA has, when you send a spacecraft a gazillion miles away, you can't send a repairman out there. It's kind of tough, you know? So they build systems that don't just not break, they build systems that can't not work. So no matter what, even if this component is literally shredded, how can we still scrub carbon dioxide or whatever? And so it's a systems analysis design problem or analysis problem, not necessarily a system issue. Let's look at the bigger picture rather than just that one system, that one point problem or point solution. And I
Yeah,
find
no,
that
like that. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that there's a big deficit in our community, I think, overall, of a lack of end-to-end systems thinking and thinking about those techniques. And, we become so obsessed with the reliability and security of components without thinking about that we can have different ways of achieving end-to-end resilience goals by taking a systems-based approach. The other thing we talked a lot in the report about was in support of the performance goals was the need to move away from lagging performance indicators more towards leading indicators.
Mhm.
So I'll give you an example. There's a lot of performance goals in the industry, as you all know, that are just out and out lagging indicators like, malware events, breaches, disasters, other types of things, or reliability failures or other types of outages. And those are necessary to continue to look at. But when you look at pretty much any other walk of life where you're delivering like high reliability or high quality, think of like a high-tech manufacturing line. They monitor the lagging indicator of, does the thing that comes off that manufacturing line have sufficient quality? But what they actually do is look at the leading indicators of, the machine's maintained in the right way, is the ingredients into the manufacturing line of sufficient high quality. So they measure all these leading indicators, and if you get them right, you can't help but get the lagging indicators okay.
Mm.
Now, the analogy you gave in the report was to think about a few shifts. So one of the leading indicators we're proposing organizations spend more time on is what percentage of their software is capable of being reproducibly built and deployed. Because again, we all know, this group knows that if you can do that, not only do you get more reliable software and you get more agile software delivery, but you also get more security because you're less fearful of upgrading software. You've got more controls in the process. And so the best way of measuring whether you're going to have lower software defects is knowing that you've got higher percentages of software under reproducible builds. Another one we talked about was measuring the
Oh,
ability
hold on,
to.
Phil. I wanted to go back to the
Yep.
first part for a moment. And I think a lot of what you're describing, the way I interpret it in my brain, is doing tabletop exercises, some form of threat modeling as the first step to understand all the things that can go bad, to then understand how we can be more resilient. Is that correct?
It is, but we also put in the report the need for stress testing. So,
Hmm.
really stressing assumptions. One of the classic examples of that, which we also recommend, is organizations testing their ability to run without network connectivity or, in particular, internet
Mhm.
connectivity. There's a lot of parts of our critical infrastructure that have made this assumption incorrectly, that a network is always going to be available. We've seen medical devices, power control, water control, that software that's put in place that ceases to operate effectively when it's not network connected and doesn't provide enough local control. And in many cases, these network based assumptions are not really for any security or reliability guarantee. They're just, they could be for kind of licensing heartbeats or other types of things. And one of the things we're also encouraging is when people do these tabletops, that they actually then run serious stress tests. Clearly, it would probably have to be in a test environment to really understand what the thresholds of failure are under circumstances like turning off network connectivity, and doing other types of extreme recovery.
I believe it was not Petya in Ukraine, where they had enough or had barely enough people to get in trucks to drive out to various points to help restore power. And some of my friends that work in industrial control systems were like, well, and this is years ago, like if that happened here, that could be a bad day, because I don't know that we have enough trucks or people to go out, depending on how wide scale the breach is, right? What you're saying is we need to understand these things and then develop a strategy to combat them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's been a few. I mean, I always remember, a similar situation with Maersk, the shipping line, that when they had their similar outage, they failed back to the captains of ships and the managers of ports being able to use traditional techniques to coordinate how they were working without the IT systems. And I think from what I've kind of read in various public sources, they were able to do this because they'd not quite finished building up their IT dependency, and it was almost fortunate that they had that event, because they were able to then build in a different level of resilience to assume that there should always be a way of managing themselves without always having fully connected, fully available technology. And I think that's the challenge we're going to have to face, is build and take advantage of all the connected systems that we enjoy, but for our most critical things, figure out how we can make sure that they can operate in a basic way, even in the presence of extreme failure.
I can't agree
Josh.
more. I got to tell you a story because I think you'll get a kick out of it, Phil. Because when you do tabletops, you have assumptions. Some of those assumptions may not be correct. And the story is actually sort of semi-related to you, sir, but not personally. A friend of mine used to be a very big co-locator, and he had some machines co-located in a data room and data center in New York. After Sandy, he went to go check on them. They were operating perfectly. Unfortunately, he just couldn't see them because the door badging system was not hooked up to the generators. And it happened to be a Google data center. I'm just pointing this out just to be funny. But it's when you don't test your assumptions, when you don't actually shut the internet connectivity off or shut the power off or shut the whatever off, it's amazing what you don't realize. So I back what you're saying 100%.
Manny's got a question on here too.
Oh, I had.
Go ahead, Mandy.
So, um, a few of the points. First off, I like the energy that comes through in the report and what you were saying, because it really, if you get down to the nitty gritty, it allows the people that are in the front lines to also branch out and really rely on creativity. So they get to be a little bit more of that MacGyver side of really looking at how to keep the physical systems running. And it made me think of a story too about needing security practitioners, even though we are so embedded in our networking and in our systems and in internet connectivity. Made me think of the same thing. Like I know of exercises where it was military and municipalities needing to go through how to evacuate mass numbers of people, and they were finding that a lot of times, because the people who had had field experience of actually figuring out construction in the field were now at retirement age or beyond. They came into all kinds of issues of not being able to physically build a bridge and get the people out. So being able to keep our security practitioners and the people, especially at the critical infrastructure, at the water, at the waterworks, at the plant. It's funny how cybersecurity will actually require that they go back to more nuts and bolts and know how to keep it running whenever there is no connectivity.
But
That's exactly right. And I think it's also really important to make sure that whatever you're testing for the situation you hope that test will mean you can meet. The classic example of this is I've seen, back to our kind of favorite industry topic of ransomware. I've worked with a few organizations over the years at board and other executive level where they ask you just, how can we be sure that we're good on ransomware? And, you can talk about all the controls, but clearly the one that really is the line of defense is making sure they've got good backups. And then so what you typically will get from a CIO or a CTO or some other executive is, yeah, my team tells me our backups are great. We test our backups all the time. Then you go, well, okay, I bet your team's testing backups in the traditional mode of backups exist to deal with individual server failures or small elements of a data center failure. Why don't you just humor me and try and do a full, what you call, what we would call in the PCAST report, a cold restart. So take a bunch of blank machines or a bunch of blank cloud instances and take your hopefully immutable backups, whether they're online or on tape, and just reboot your company and just see if you can do it. And literally 9 times out of 10, maybe even more extreme, they can't do that because the backups don't contain the software they need. They don't contain the indexes for the backups. They make an assumption that when they're recovering from backup, that the entire environment hasn't been wiped, and that's clearly invalid in many instances. And then when they go and do that, they realize they've got to re-engineer that, and they would only believe and find that when they actually did the stressed test of really recovering a bunch of backups to a bunch of blank machines. And one of the things I always like to ask people, because it's amusing, because many people don't know it and they figure it out, is what's the reboot time for your, not just for your server, but for your business or your entire company? What's the time to reboot or the time to cold restart? And again, in the report, that's another one of the leading indicator metrics we suggest. And we got some rocks thrown at us for that one because it's tough. But the great thing, like a lot of these leading indicator metrics, if you get that right, it has so many adjacent business and other benefits, not just the security benefit, which is another great thing about these leading indicators.
So, would the leading indicators be one of your top 3 points from the report that you feel actually boost the infield personnel most quickly?
Yeah. And again,
That's it.
it's a good
Okay.
point, because we really went into the leading indicators and thinking, how can these be not just the right goal, but how can they be helpful to security professionals? And again, back on that point of reproducible software builds, one of the things that I've had some conversations with various boards in various large organizations, and they ask you, well, what's the best cybersecurity metric? And I pretty much always say it at least includes what percentage of your software is capable of being rebuilt. And that means you have to have all your software under control, all the good things that we all know about. And occasionally I'll get this criticism that basically says, well, isn't that kind of a bit in the weeds? Isn't it like a weird technical thing for boards to be caring about? And I just give them the analogy all the time is, imagine you're talking to your chief financial officer. And if you ask your chief financial officer, are all the finances under control? Do we have all the accounts reconciled? Is all the money in one logical place? And if the CFO went, yeah, well, not really. We've kind of got some over here, and I don't really know where that is, and we've kind of got it tracked in spreadsheets, you'd have a new CFO pretty much immediately. But if the board asks the CIO, have you got all your software under control? It's not always a great answer. It's almost never a great answer. To be fair, there's some amazing companies out there that have got this under control. And I'm not criticizing the organizations that don't, because it's a hard problem, but it's a problem the CISO shouldn't be fighting. It should be a board requiring that their organization get one of their main assets, which is their software, under as much control as they have of their financial assets, their physical assets, their key intellectual property. And there's no reason why the board shouldn't be asking for that. And again, we designed all the leading indicators to be things that the board should be asking of the business leaders and the IT leaders to help the CISOs get what they need to get done.
It's interesting too, because asset management, and that's an over like it's funny. Anytime I say asset management, I'm like, oh, but I don't mean sticking an asset tag on everyone's laptop and then shipping it or handing out to employees, right? Asset is a very overloaded term in this context, and given the amount of work it takes to gain control over all of your digital assets, let's say, these industrial control systems facilities and companies are typically understaffed, right? So that's what we've seen. We've covered other reports and studies, and CISA has reported that there's a large understaffing in power, water, gas, whatever the vertical is. How do we overcome that? Because that inevitably leads to vulnerabilities, to exposures, right?
Well, again, one of the things we called out in the report, and again, this is not to diminish the great work that does go on in a lot of companies,
Sure.
in that public-private partnership thing we always talk about. But there is a degree of disconnection between executive level management and executive level government personnel that pounds the table that more should be done. And we use this phrase in the report that tone at the top needs to be connected to resources in the ranks to actually get stuff done. And one of the things that we call out is the need for sector risk management agencies and private sector organizations to actually work out whether they've got the right amount of people with the right skills to actually achieve the pounding of the table from the very senior people that state, well, of course, we must have these kind of great security, great resilience. Well, you've actually, as we all know, you've actually got to do some work to make that happen. You need some resources to do that. The one thing that is a little bit tricky, and I kind of learned this during the development of the report and kind of, bad on me for not knowing it, is a lot of these local utilities, whether it's water or electricity, they're not really in charge of their own destiny. So they're very light on resources, um, but it's not some kind of commercial choice that they're not spending enough on security. They're not trying to kind of protect the bottom line. They're often operating under the direction of local or state level commissions that like set almost like tariffs of how much revenue they can collect from people and what that can be
Mm.
spent on. And again, one of the things we pushed out in the report is the need for all of the government agencies, whether it's energy or other agencies, should actually not just send more dictates to all of these local companies, but they should actually address the issue that commissions and state authorities should also figure out the funding path so that they actually have the funding to do what we're telling them to do. The other thing as well, I mean, and this is something that
Well, I just want to go back to that for a moment, Phil, because like if you look at these industrial controls organizations that the state limits their revenue, they probably want to say, well, just charge everyone more for water, then we'll have enough budget for IT
Uh,
security. But
but
obviously, there's political there's a lot of ramifications to that, so we can't just basically tax people more. I mean, not just necessarily. I mean, it is a
Well,
tax,
so I
sort of.
agree with that. You got to be really careful on these things, and I don't think we should get into a mode where this is tax more people to pass more things through to security product vendors, for example.
Yeah,
And so one of the things I think, again, this is something we also called out in the report, and and this is why I think it was good that putting my Google hat on. Um, we clearly call out there's a role to play for tech companies, software companies to have better security and better security by design and by default. So it shouldn't be on these small companies having to figure out how to patch up software and controls delivered to them by having to buy security products sometimes from the same vendor that's giving them the thing that has the issue. That should just
right.
not be happening. And the great thing here is, so I'm a big fan of thinking of 80/20s in everything. And so the challenge we've got is that 80% of all of this critical infrastructure is underpinned by a small number, 20% of tech companies, industry specific software providers, hardware providers. And so that's a worry from a concentration risk perspective, because if there's a vulnerability there, you get this big effect. But it's also a massive opportunity, because if you can get that right, you can fix large proportions of whole industries. And so while we do need to address a little bit of the funding issue, I think, we're all of the mind that all of the tech companies, the hardware companies, the software providers at industry specific and national level need to do even more on secure by design and secure by default to help all of the consumers of technology that don't have the capabilities to do this for themselves.
No, I agree, because I think if we had more vendors in this context of, no default passwords, over the air updates or frequent updates, but less friction on the updates, right? We can cut out in the supply chain downstream. There's going to be less problems, right? Essentially, is what you're recommending in the report.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think, and this sounds one of those kind of obvious things to say, but I just think all parties on the public-private divide and the public-private partnership just need to be more honest with each other about like what the problems are, and I
Mm.
think there's far too much out there where the answer is build and buy more security products as opposed to figure out how to actually just deliver secure products. So ultimately, I'd like to see less security products and more secure products.
I agree, because, and we've said this over the years, Phil. Anytime you are implementing a security solution, you're also increasing your attack surface. And while you're doing that to secure your organization, it's still an attack surface.
Well,
And often, as we've seen with some of the VPN platforms out there and some of the other security tools, they're not even a protected attack surface; they're just an attack surface, right?
I was thinking the same thing and thinking about how to say that without, I don't want to name names necessarily, because we all live in glass houses, right? But I think there's certain situations and certain products and solutions that really, it's interesting how attackers will shine a spotlight on it. And then it kind of goes back to where you started in this interview, right? Attackers shine a spotlight on it when you go, oh, that's really bad. We need to go fix that problem, right? But we're not fixing the fundamental problems that got us here, which is hard.
Well, fixing the fundamental problems would cause us to actually have to think about things. God help us if we try to think about things.
Go ahead, Mandy.
well, a few things. I think that means that then the developers would have to be not just thrilled about what their thought was on developing, but actually on, oh, where is every implication of what I'm developing from the start? And that is a complex thing for any human because we like what we like. We like what we are going after. We like what we are interested in. But I think this is a good point to talk about the observatories. Please, I really want to read this one sentence from the report because the recommendation 2.8 establish a national critical infrastructure observatory. Developing a national critical infrastructure observatory will ensure that our understanding of our critical infrastructure and its interdependence is at least as good as the understandings that our adversaries have. And I feel like that was a huge thing. Because we're talking about, like, yes,
Right.
an intrepid bad actor or these huge, you mentioned ransomware, like the giant ransomware criminal gangs that are shining a spotlight and they're mapping everything diligently because they are looking for the error. How can you tell more about the observatory and what the goal is and hoping that would be seen from what the observatory reports?
Yeah, so exactly right. In the section you read out, we like all of you, we kind of knew this anyway. But as part of conducting research for the report, we spoke to a lot of organizations, and it really came through. You see this in open source intelligence, but you also see it in other types of intelligence where we know our adversaries are profiling and mapping our critical infrastructure, and they have very deep knowledge of what depends on what and what's running where and what are the modes of which that can be attacked to cause us the most significant harm. And we don't have that view of ourselves when we look at even some of the best efforts to date to understand cross-sector dependencies. They're driven from tabletop exercises and self-assessment spreadsheets and manual mapping. That there have been some exceptions to that in some sectors where it's been a little bit more systematized. But essentially what we're saying in the recommendation to create a national critical infrastructure observatory is to this maybe a bit of an extreme way of thinking about it, is essentially to build a digital twin of the United States critical infrastructure in some restricted use case where we can collect the dependencies, collect the maps of services, and really take an adversarial methodology to look at ourselves and not just look at ourselves to find point vulnerabilities, to build up that model of the whole system, and then start to use it to analyze where the concentration risks are, where there's unexpected dependencies. If you've got a system model, you can start to run simulations. You can run Monte Carlo simulations of various different failures, and you can then learn from that and identify the things that no one individual human who doesn't have that oversight, they can't spot those hidden dependencies. It also is useful in times of crisis for you to be able to say, okay, this attack has appeared. What do we have to now prepare for in terms of what the knock-on effects are? What typically happens today in organizations like the DHS JCDC, which is great. Kudos to DHS for setting up and running that. But when things like Log4j happen and other things, there's a degree of systematization, but there's also a large amount of conversation to understand the impact. If we had a critical infrastructure observatory, we'd be able to do these things in real time for more than just the major events, but for the minor events that could become the major events. So we're already working with DHS and a number of other agencies on what it takes to take some existing techniques and some existing research programs and try and stand this thing up. So we're pretty hopeful on this, and we definitely need it. The other thing, at the risk of bringing up everybody's favorite topic of AI, this is also one of these things. If you had a system map, one of the great things generative AI is good at is analyzing large dependency graphs and generating hypotheses of multi-step attacks that humans don't necessarily think of, for us to then
Right.
even further get ahead of the attackers and fix things before they've even postulated these things.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it comes down to threat modeling and tabletop, and using AI for that, I think, is a great use case as well.
Yeah, Phil,
One of my concerns. Go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
quantification of risk is in its infancy, and you're talking about doing something at mass scale of real-time quantification of risk. That is fascinating to me. I've been working on a risk quantification standard for a while, and just beating my head against a wall. You can see, the effects are pretty clear, and I think that the observatory you're talking about is going to have to be an experiment in motion, if that makes sense. It's really going to be experimental for quite a while, but I love it.
Well, the other thing as well is you're right to hit on the fact that these are, unlike some other government reports and recommendations. Sometimes the recommendations are like, do the thing you know you should be doing, and we've now put it in a report, so just get on and do it. There's a ton of stuff in this report which is like totally in the domain of like DARPA and other advanced research projects agencies, because it sounds a great and obvious thing to do, but exactly as you just described it, these scale problems and mapping problems and risk quantification problems they're right on the edge of our capabilities, if not beyond our capabilities. And again, one of the other things we recommend in the report is that all the different ARPAs, so there's DARPA for defense, there's IARPA for intelligence, there's a healthcare ARPA, there's an infrastructure ARPA, there's various of these advanced research project agencies that do great work. A lot of them are doing independent work on this, and we're working with the White House on. I don't think any of them should be slammed together. That's, I think they're innovative in their own right, but there's a lot of alignment that could be done to solve some of the challenges around risk quantification that the observatory will bring up, and aligning the various ARPAs on that is actually going to be pretty productive, I think.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too, Phil, that I talked about this with when we talked with Josh Corman about the technical debt that we have today, that we could develop this fantastic program, and like moving forward from a certain point, we don't take in any new technology that doesn't have any known vulnerabilities and is way more resilient, but we have a ton of legacy infrastructure, especially here in the US. Not especially, but every country has its own, everyone has technical debt, but we've got it in a big way in industrial control systems. Was there recommendations on that, or if not, what are your thoughts on how we deal with our technical debt?
Well, so it's funny. Yeah, one of the leading indicators we suggest as well is that organizations disclose what they have as a preventative maintenance budget. So again, I have a bit of an industrial background, so I always kind of think in terms of physical systems. So again, if you're running a pharmaceutical production line or a high-tech production line or a chip manufacturing production line, you have explicit preventative maintenance budgets that you're set to maintain the machines, to maintain the quality process. And you cannot scrimp on that preventative maintenance, because when you do, it blows up in a big way. Right. I think IT and OT environments should have a preventative maintenance budget that is explicitly allocated, and that's what they can use to pay down technical debt, pay down architectural debt, keep security up to date, manage kind of the reliability updates of the system, all these stuff you would do in classic preventative maintenance. And a bit like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with SRE error budgets in our kind of site reliability engineering concept. You can imagine a methodology where you're forced to increase or decrease your preventative maintenance budget depending on your architectural choices, which would incent the right architectural behaviors. But fundamentally, the reason we build up technical debt is because we don't have explicitly assigned goals and preventative maintenance objectives. And one of the things, again, one of the other recommendations in the report that we were a bit delicate with, because it's a bit contentious, is the notion that there should also be radical transparency. So organizations disclosing what their preventative maintenance budget is, not to say that there should be a government standard for you should spend X, but you should disclose it and let transparency map against what your actual results are, and then we'll all learn what the appropriate degree of preventative maintenance is. But having explicit preventative maintenance budgets, I think, is going to be key. And the organizations I've seen do it have remarkable good effects very quickly on it.
Yeah, I think it's also like an economic incentive. I think you can save the company money by doing this preventative maintenance, right? I've always been a huge
Mhm.
fan of this in IT systems, software, hardware, and going, yeah, I know that that device is probably going to fail or need some kind of software update or experience a power outage. You know what? I'm going to do it on my own during a maintenance window or at a predetermined time, and then where I can deal with it then, not at a mission critical time, such as when we're about to record a podcast, as an example. I want to go apply the firmware update, reboot the thing, or whatever it is before that happens, right? And swap the device out before it becomes a problem in production.
Yeah.
But it's interesting as well, because I think there's too much of a gap, especially in critical infrastructure, between engineering practices and IT
Mm,
practices. And one of the things we also
Mhm.
recommended in the report is that engineering professions formally include cyber physical goals as part of their engineering professions. So, as many of you will know, there's a thing called ABET that accredits engineering programs. So, if you're a civil engineer, mechanical, chemical, electrical engineer, you're subject to professional qualifications, you're subject to certification, you become a professional engineer, and you have to attend an education program, typically a degree that is ABET accredited. One of the things we're working on is how to get cyber physical as part of that, so that it's not just on the IT guys and gals to try and drive this stuff. It's the chief mechanical engineer who
Yeah.
signs off on a water utility, or the civil engineer that does that, should go, who's looked at the preventative maintenance schedule for the operational technology systems? That should be part of the engineering sign off that a professional
right.
engineer signs off. So I think, there's a lot of pushback against the notion that all IT people should be professional engineers. I think that's probably correct. I think some should be, but our requirements should
No.
absolutely be in the framework for all of the other professional engineers that are so key to our critical infrastructure. And I think that's something that we're going to keep pushing as part of the report as well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a hot potato that people pass around. Like, oh, we're going to build this great, engineer these great systems to manage the water supply for the city. And oh, by the way, like there's a bunch of Windows XP boxes that run it all, but that's someone else's problem, right? That's IT's problem, and IT's going, well, you can't have these Windows XP systems. The engineers are like, but we need those to control the things, and that's how we end up where
And
we are now.
if it wasn't a problem today, it'll be a problem. I mean, if it's not our problem today, it'll be IT's problem 20 years from now.
Right,
But
right.
that's okay because that's 20 years and our profit schedule is 1 quarter.
Well,
Yeah, but it's
maybe
funny.
in enterprise.
It's funny. One of my favorite things to do is in any industrial facility that I just happen to be in for various reasons, is going up to the nice shiny new machine that's got the nice vendor logo on it, and it looks wonderful. And then you open the door, and inside is like, I've seen like DOS 3.1 machines like running the thing. But you'd never know unless you kind of open the thing up and look
Oh, so
inside
they
what's
they
inside
actually
the
put
shiny
it in
machine.
like a really shiny, nice case, but inside it's like a
Yeah.
486.
Oh yeah, no, you've
DOS.
got
Yeah,
those nice racks in the data center. They're
yeah, yeah,
all
yeah.
pretty
Right,
with a
right.
nice logo on it, and yet I see Phil's been into some of the data centers I've
Yeah,
worked
you've been
in.
in. Yep, yep.
Look, it's just
Yeah, well, exactly. All these appliances that are actually 20-year-old Linux machines. Yeah.
oh my god.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to interject there a little bit because I come from construction, blue collar trades. Um, I specialized in hydrology and erosion control and wastewater treatment plants and all kinds of things like that. And I would say that a lot of times IT, because of the disconnect with tradesmen, so let's say you steam fitters, you're talking about, whatever, whoever is working there, making them more aware that cybersecurity resiliency is needed because there's such a large overlap of tradespeople and in engineering that have keen mechanical and networking interests, whether it's from gaming or from many other things. So having somebody in the field that has, even if it's not IT, like that is such a huge help because I've seen it many times that it's the person that is a hobbyist on the weekend doing some kind of weird hardware hacking that can bring something to IT or to the management. I really liked seeing that point. And I like the point in your report as well about the international collaboration and actually pushing the State Department to grant visas in a timely manner.
This absolutely. I didn't know about this. Again, this is one that drives me nuts. So we get worried, for example, about China being dominant. They became dominant in the 5G standardization process. They've become more dominant in the IETF, various groups, and we need to reassert, U.S. government and U.S. technology company presence in the standards bodies. And again, I've been involved in standards on and off, but I didn't really quite intuitively get this, that the way you drive standards is you host the standards meetings. It's kind of obvious in hindsight. And you have to drive, more of your people can show up if you're actually hosting the meetings. And it's been a big issue. We've not been granting enough visas for people to come from other countries to attend standards conferences that we host in the United States. Therefore, all of the conferences have moved to other parts of the world, which makes it easier for all of their people to turn up and none of our people to turn up.
Right.
And so there's, we put a key recommendation in for the Department of State to really look at how to issue more visas to get more people to be able to come to the US to attend standards meetings. And we think that's going to be one of those driving factors that lets us, to be fair to government, there's been a huge amount of work from many government agencies to ramp up the standards process, because we saw what happened in 5G, and I think we're doing a lot else. But this would also really be a remarkable difference if we could get more visas to have more people attend standards meetings inside the US. Would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know that FedRAMP, which is a tiny little federal standard, right? You might have heard of it, is actually run by China.
What?
Yeah, China runs the standards organization that accredits third-party assessment organizations to actually certify organizations for FedRAMP.
Interesting.
Mind-boggling.
What?
And I thought, being Google Cloud, you'd appreciate that, sir.
You mentioned 5G, and it's interesting. I was on another podcast talking about the cranes in the ports that were discovered to have, I think it was 4G or some kind of cellular modem technology in there. Phil, did you address the SBOM or the hardware and or software bill of materials in all of the devices that we're bringing into our enterprises, but also our critical infrastructure as well?
Yeah, we made some recommendations on that being part of many of the leading indicators that although we were kind of used some language that was cautious in our support of SBOM. I think the whole software bill of materials and associated hardware bill of materials, I describe them as necessary but not sufficient. And it kind of worries me that we've got so focused on SBOM. And again, big fan. I think SBOM is vitally important, but having an SBOM of everything is really not going to change anything unless you actually use it to actually create some operational process that lets you update things as a result of spotting what is not right because of what you've seen in the SBOM. But more importantly, I worry that we're not doing enough on things like SALSA, the SLSA.dev, which is an open standard that originated at Google, which describes end-to-end secure build and provenance processes. So you need, the analogy I always give, it's like restaurants. So you could go into a restaurant and you could have the bill of materials of all of the ingredients, and it's the best ingredients in the world. But if the chef, is never washing their hands after they go to the bathroom, then you're going to have a hygiene problem. So you also need to look at the process by which the food is built from those ingredients. And so we need SBOM plus SALSA. And we were very clear to call that out, because I worry a little bit that everybody's assuming SBOM is going to be this magic thing that actually helps us through a software supply chain. And it's actually a broader build problem as well.
But you also have to do something or not do something based on the bill of materials, right?
Yeah,
And the
exactly.
analogy is in the ingredient list, if it said it had peanuts in it, but you didn't really do anything about it, people are still going to have allergic reactions. So,
Right.
yeah.
And the other one too, like, yeah, it's an ingredients list, but if you don't actually do anything with those ingredients, like you don't put them together, you don't cook them, you don't
Yeah,
serve them, it's useless. It's all about how you use it.
absolutely.
So yeah, it's not a panacea. It's just some portion of the medicine that you can take to make things better.
Mm. Anything else in the report, Phil, that you wanted to highlight?
No, I think we covered the main ones. Again, what I'll just kind of really highlight is, this sounds a little bit kind of, mother had an apple pie, but everybody is doing their best. Everybody is doing the best job that they possibly can. There's some fantastic people in all of these government agencies. A lot of them are working hard with too few resources. You look at the private sector, again, everybody's doing as much as they can. I mean, I think that could be debatable, but I think a lot of people are working in constraints that we may not always understand. And what we tried to get across in the report is that this is not the recommendations are not a dig at people not doing enough. What we're trying to call out is this is like a tragedy of the commons. It's a systems problem that no matter how many resources we apply in the current construct, it's not going to make enough difference unless we change the approach by which we use the resources we've got. And then hopefully any additional resources will have outsized effects on top of that. So we're just trying to change the game a little bit, tilt the playing field in our favor. But we're really, always impressed with all of the people in government that are working on this every day. They're often doing it against the odds, and there's probably more victories behind the scenes that we don't publicly know about, that nobody gets any credit for. We only see the failures. But hopefully the report is going to be of some use to public and private sectors to help change the way we're doing things, to start tilting the game in our favor.
Mandy?
I was curious that for the SOC, for the CISOs, for people, the security practitioners, what would you forecast as one of the first things they could start seeing and go, "Oh, wow, that report's actually being acted on"?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably going to be in the ways that the sector risk management agencies start to articulate the expectations and those minimum viable delivery objectives, and more senior engagement from uh, the government agencies with boards and CEOs of major companies. And so I would hope sooner rather than later that we'll start to see this language of minimum viable delivery objectives, and then boards and CEOs saying, what are we going to do in defining these things? And it'll cause all of those things we talked about earlier in terms of looking at the tail risks, doing the stress testing, as well as doing the tabletops, and then executives proactively seeking some of these more extreme events that the CISOs and other people probably already know about is a risk, and having them better surfaced. I hope that will come to fruition, and then getting going on the critical infrastructure observatory in a kind of minimum viable product way, so it doesn't become a 5-year research program and deliver something much later. Having some incremental results of that maybe gives us collectively more um, threat intelligence, not just of what the bad actors are doing, but where we're best positioned to defend, and giving more targeted instruction to critical infrastructure organizations to help on that. I think hopefully we'll see some benefit from that. But, again, I'm realistic. I think one of the things that we'll probably see is lots of small activities that make a small difference, that when you look back in 5 years, we'll go, wow, that made a big difference, but we won't notice it at the time.
Nice.
Phil, we just have 5 questions left for you. Are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Yeah, sure.
3 words to describe yourself.
Former software engineer.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Poison.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
7 Habits of Highly Effective Security People.
Nice. what is your favorite hacker movie?
War games.
Yes.
Choose. we all have our favorites, and we cheer whenever. Yeah. Phil, choose 3 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
3 to be parents. Would it be 2
sorry,
to be
so-
parents?
I said
I
said
choose
3.
2 celebrities.
You know,
Yeah.
the teleprompter somehow says 3 celebrities instead of 2, and that's
thought you were-
because
So-
Burgundy
so-
reads
so-
what's on the teleprompter.
All right. So this could go in all sorts of different places. But 2, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher.
There you go.
Oh, very nice.
Phil,
And I'm
thank
sure
you
they actually
so-
enjoy being with each other as well.
Probably. So, Phil, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly. We appreciate the time you spent with us, and we appreciate all of your work. So, thank you again.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
With that, we'll be right back in a few moments. Stay tuned for the security news.